Hi, welcome back. I was going to try to read to you outside today because it's really nice. And I've been outside a little bit, just trying to tidy up the yard. It's supposed to be, it's about, it's probably 50 degrees out there right now. And I'd show it to you, but then you can't see with the way cameras work. Excuse me, I didn't get too dressed up, but I figured we'd sit in the living room now because I'm tired from raking. This chapter is a pretty long one, and it's kind of a heavy one for such a nice day, but that's the way life is, right? First you're up and then you're down, and that's the way the world goes round. Chapter 11, Passing the Peace. And the epigraph on this one is, "The peace of the Lord be always with you." And that's from the Book of Common Prayer. In our church, every Sunday we pass the peace. We turn to our neighbors, shake hands, and say, "The peace of the Lord be always with you." And they respond, "And also with you." Or at least that's how we're supposed to do it, according to the Book of Common Prayer. We usually just say, "Lord's peace," or plain peace. Since there are only about a dozen of us, we walk around and greet each person. Sometimes there are hugs and often quiet conversations about why we need a little peace or about our gratitude for receiving it. And this does kind of remind you that Zoom church isn't really the same, is it? Episcopalians do this seventh inning stretch with a purpose. It comes over halfway through the service, after the lessons and prayers, and what I like to think of as the business end of Sunday worship, before the more serious, introspective, and spiritual conclusion, communion or Holy Eucharist. The weekly reminder of Christ's death and resurrection is heavy stuff, even for those of us who reenact it regularly. The break for peace happens right after the confession of sin. That's when we acknowledge having not loved our neighbors as ourselves and not loving God with our whole hearts. We ask forgiveness out loud and in unison for what we have done and left undone. Trust me, the silent inner itemized list is long, and it is why, in large part, I attend church. It's why I practice my religion. It's also why when Father Bob Marin, a Catholic priest, said, "Church is not a bunker, it's a diving board to the world," I knew exactly what he meant. Then he quoted Soren Kierkegaard, "Jesus does not need admirers, he needs followers." In other words, following the teachings of Jesus has very little to do with kneeling before his cross and everything to do with standing up for the things he did. The trick is knowing if what you are standing up for is what Jesus meant. I mean, the whole "what would Jesus do" question is a lot less simple than you'd think. It is, as Father Bob says, a question that can only be answered when listening to what God is saying rather than put words in his mouth. Or as C.S. Lewis famously observed, he didn't pray in order for God to understand him. Rather, he said, so he would understand God. Obviously, I am not the first person to ponder this. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was at a low point during his struggle for civil rights, he confessed that he was afraid he was losing his courage, and if people saw him do that, they'd lose theirs. He asked God if it was better to pray for change or to march for change, and he said, and this is what I think truly separates holy men and women from the rest of us, God answered him. God told Dr. King to get off his knees and stand up for righteousness, truth, and justice. On the other hand, I had been asking God for a week what to do about a peace march planned to protest the ongoing war in Iraq. Again, remember, this book came out in 2010 and was written between 2005 and 2009 or so. It is better to walk through town for peace. Is it better to walk through town for peace or stay at home and pray about it? I had not received an answer. God did not call back. He did not wake me in the middle of the night with a shout or even a whisper to me during a snowshoe in the woods. But I hadn't given up. I had been attending a Lenten retreat with Father Bob at the Sacred Heart Catholic Church every night for a week. He traveled to Haines from Minnesota to give a lecture series to the parish and those similarly sentimented, like me. There were about 10 of us. The weather may have had something to do with the small turnout. It snowed hard every single time we met. Anyway, Father Bob spoke with as much animation, preparation, and assumption of a certain level of education and worldliness as if we were in a packed university lecture hall. He's from Boston originally and a member of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. I hope I pronounced that right. Founded by a Frenchman in 1816. The Oblates, or Oblates, accentuate the positive in order to help people find the good within themselves. They travel the world preaching the gospel. Father Bob lectures all over the country, and not just in big places, but in small, out-of-the-way communities like Haines. The early Oblates did not condemn so-called sinners who went to the bars instead of attending Mass. Instead, they met them in the taverns and befriended and helped them. As Father Bob said, anyone can tell you what's wrong with you. We tell you what's right. There was a lot right about Jim Fair, a furnace and heating system repairman from New York who had never lost his thick accent, had a friendly way about him, and sported a droopy, old-fashioned mustache. The first time we met, Jim said, "I've heard you're from New York too, aren't you?" and wondered why I didn't sound like it. My New York was more suburban, and I suspect more affluent than his. But here's the thing about Jim. When I was around him, I wished I had a real New York accent too. I wished my voice sounded more Brooklyn and less NPR. When I was around Jim, I wanted to be more like him. I wanted to be his friend. I think everyone did. Jim maintained the funky heating systems in the Chilkat Center for the Arts, the former cannery building turned theater where we have church on Sundays, and where Lee Heinmiller, who lives across the alley, also has kept watch for many years. It was not uncommon to see the bearded and ponytailed Lee limping on bad knees that have bowed from years of clinket dancing with the now defunct Chilkat dancers, and Big Jim, with his Vietnam veteran's cap and army camouflage jacket, banging on pipes before church on cold Sunday mornings. Jim didn't mind being called out on weekends or nights. He liked to help, and he liked talking with you while he worked. It was almost as common to see Jim's truck parked in a pullout along the river just past the airport when Chip and I were riding our bikes at 5 on summer mornings. He'd be there sleeping off a hard night, or perhaps continuing one. When Jim was drinking, it was difficult to be around him. I suppose he knew that and removed himself from the community. When Jim's liver failed, he was so ill that his wife put him into a veterans home in Stony Brook, New York, out on Long Island, and she and their daughter moved back east to be closer to him and the rest of their family. 6 months later, he died. I was writing the obituary and contacted the family on the phone and via email, but the pain from the loss was just too distracting for them, and they asked me to wait until they were more prepared to share Jim's story. While time may not heal, it does give you perspective. Considering how Jim had died and the way he had abruptly left Haines, and the sorrow his passing had brought to his family, it was a surprise when 3 months later a tribute to Jim, written by his wife, Joanne, was read at her request at the annual Veterans Day dinner at the Haines American Legion. It was brave and frank and a reminder that not all casualties of war take place on the battlefield. Quote, "His battle with alcohol was his undoing," unquote, Joanne wrote. Quote, "The years of abuse took their toll. Despite Herculean efforts by the best EMT staff any town could ask for, extensive help at the clinic and the VA, Jim's condition deteriorated to the point where he spent 5 months at Juneau's Bartlett Hospital before being transported to the Long Island Veterans Home," unquote. It was a long way from the Alaskan dream that had brought the fairs here in 1989, a lifelong desire of Jim's, spurred on by stories of his grandfather's Klondike goldfield adventures and subsequent years spent prospecting in the Wrangell St. Elias Mountains, where he had owned the North Midas Copper Company. Jim proudly took over Haynes Heating Service on Alaska Day in 1993, which he took to be a very good sign. I began working on his obituary by rereading the tribute at the Legion, and then I called and emailed Joanne, who had remained in New York, for the rest of the information, which this time she willingly gave. Because of the circumstances of Jim's death, I decided to let Joanne tell much of his life story, and I quoted her extensively. It was a departure from the way I usually write obituaries. In our paper, they are news pieces, rather than the paid commentaries submitted by family members that most newspapers publish on the obituary page. I also did it because since my own trauma, I realized how much sharing the details had helped me heal. James Joseph Fair III was born in 1950 and grew up on Long Island. As a teenager, he had learned his trade in a steamfitter's apprenticeship program. He left high school a month after turning 17 to voluntarily serve in Vietnam. Jim was very proud of the fact that the Fairs had fought in every war since the Civil War and always considered himself a soldier by birth, Joanne wrote. He learned to drive tanks in Germany and arrived in Vietnam in time for the Tet Offensive. Joanne noted that he saw extensive combat for 9 months, until his camp was bombed and he suffered serious injuries to his leg and chest and was sent home, honorably discharged, and issued a Purple Heart in 1970. But, she said, he had a very difficult time upon his return to a sometimes, this is her words, cruel and hostile reception amidst anti-war rallies. He began to drink heavily, she said. Joanne told their history, which could have been a movie, of how they met in 1970 and dated for 4 years, but his alcoholism caused them to part as friends, and of how in 1977 Jim married another woman, had a daughter, and then divorced 5 years later. He and Joanne were reunited by friends who thought they were meant for each other and that love would prevail. This time it did, and they married. Jim's dream was to go to Alaska, so off we went, Joanne wrote. They headed west with all their belongings in a Ryder truck. I could imagine the adventure of it all, the planning, the goodbyes, the hugs, the happy anticipation during the long drive of cabins in the woods and living off the land. It's what Chip and I did. It's what so many Alaskans of Jim and Joanne's generation did. Their daughter was born on Christmas Day, 1989 in Juneau. They settled in Haines shortly after that. Joanne wrote that her husband loved Haines, especially salmon fishing and prospecting in the old gold mining district near Porcupine. They had a good life here, she wrote, and she made sure we all knew that Jim took great pride in his daughters and his military service. Which brings me right back to the Peace March. I had been thinking about Jim and guys like Jim. Haines and Cluckwan sent 29 men to Vietnam, local boys who thankfully all came home. Since that time, many more vets have arrived. A lot of them don't wear veterans' caps or hang out at the Legion. This is part of the reason why, when the Haines People for Peace group announced they were planning a walk for peace on the anniversary of the start of the war in Iraq, I fretted so much about whether to attend. I didn't want to be disrespectful or inadvertently cause the kind of harm Joanne said drove Jim to drink. Chip hadn't spent 2 minutes thinking about it. When I asked him about 12 times in one day if he thought I should go, he always answered, "It's up to you." When I asked him if he was going, he said he'd decide when the time came. When I complained that I was so sick about the war I was thinking of moving to the Yukon, he said the snow has everyone depressed, Hev, and it's colder up there, and there's no ocean. Chip and I were by ourselves for a whole week for the first time since Eliza was born. Well, that's if you don't count the 3 weeks we were together in Seattle while I was in the hospital and the nursing home, which I don't, since we weren't exactly together in the biblical sense. I was immobilized with an external fixillator holding my bones together like a vise. It consisted of 2 long titanium screws drilled into my hip bones and bolted to carbon fiber rods that crossed my abdomen. For months I couldn't roll over, and in those Seattle weeks, the only way I could sit up was to raise the head of the mechanical bed. After I was back in Haines, Dr. Len Feldman and Lori Dedurian, the acupuncturist, removed it. Right here in my living room. I was actually on the window seat back there because my bed was right over here. And on a cloudy day, I'll show you that. Sunroom is right there. Trixie's on the couch now. That was where my bed was. Anyway, where was I? Okay, so they did this right here in the living room by unbolting the rods and using them as handles to unwind the screws in my bones. I gotta find, no, oh, sorry. This is a little traumatic to tell you this right now. I knew this was a serious one, but I forgot this was in it. I thought it was just about Jim, and that's enough. Okay, here's what happened. One side was stuck, and Len, or maybe Lori, it is nice that I have forgotten some of those things, isn't it? Anyway, one of them had to wind the screw back into my hip in order to release it from the bone. It was something Hawkeye from MASH might do, or a scene from The Red Badge of Courage. I bit down on a bandana to keep from screaming, and Chip held my arms down. As I said, that time together didn't count. But now we really were home alone. It was spring break at school, and Eliza was skiing in Utah with Christian, our son, and Sarah was hosting her 2 younger sisters at Washington State University for the week. Chip and I worked in the mornings and then met for a snowshoe in the afternoon. We had dinner with a candle and a bottle of wine in the kitchen, and we kissed with the bedroom door open. After months of recuperation, we were back to normal, only better. I no longer worried as much if the house was clean or if dinner was on time. I can't believe I put that in a book. And Chip had lost the tense look in his eyes he had for a long time after the accident. He did tell me, I better read that. I no longer worried as much if the house was clean or if dinner was on time. And Chip had lost the tense look in his eyes he had for a long time after my accident. He did tell me one day that he does the taxes early now instead of waiting until the last minute because something unforeseen could come up. You think? In April? Although surprises as dramatic as mine are not the norm, until now, especially at the end of a long winter. Yeah, Chip still, our taxes were done like in February. And I think today is, well, we're just past tax day now, aren't we? Anyway, where was I? Now I'm getting all distracted by bedroom doors being open. It had been another very quiet week. I attended the Lenten retreat while Chip did a lot of Sudokus. The conversations at Mountain Market and the Bamboo Room were about whether or not we would break the all-time snowfall record and what time it was, prompting Matt, the new reporter at the Chilkat Valley News, who had come from Ohio, to mumble, "Snow in Alaska is not news, and neither is daylight savings time." The record keeper said we had only a couple of inches to go before we passed the 294-inch mark. You figure out how many feet that is, Matt said. I don't really care. I think Matt may have been regretting his career choice. I know he was regretting his cabin site, the darling little shack 6 miles from town right on Paradise Cove had seemed like Eden in August when he had signed the winter lease. But keeping the stove stoked and hauling water had not been easy. The last big snowstorm left his truck so buried he'd been hitchhiking back and forth to the office in town. Well, mainly just forth. He hadn't been home in a week. I'm basically couch surfing, he said one night after dinner at our house, glancing at the sofa by the fire. That would be this one. I brought him a blanket and pillow. In the morning, he said it was the most peaceful sleep he'd had in days. Time was in the news as well, because when the rest of the nation had sprung their clocks an hour ahead, the Alaska state-owned and operated ferry system didn't. Someone forgot to make the change on the fleet's printed schedules. The ships were running from Bellingham up to Skagway and back, stopping in all the small ports along the way on winter time. When I called to ask if the ferry from Juneau was on time, the conversation with my friend Joanne Waterman, who works at the ferry terminal, went something like this. Hi, Joanne. Hi, Heather. Staying warm? Yep. Is the ferry on time? Yes. It gets in at 1:30? No, 2:30. I thought you said it was on time, Joanne. It is on the old time, dear. And then she started singing, Does anyone really know what time it is? Joanne has a beautiful voice, and really, that's her. I should have been glad this was the biggest gripe with the government in my world. I should have, and I would have if it were. When I told Chip for about the 10th time that I'd made up my mind and that I would for sure participate in the Peace March, he said, it won't stop the war. It also may make Haines less, rather than more, peaceful. This community is small enough to resemble a large extended family. And even though we have plenty of old protesters in the Klan, we also have all those veterans. Not so old soldiers like Jim and his friend Ron, a freelance preacher sort of guy who specializes in post-traumatic stress disorder. Ron helped Jim when he was down. He didn't cross the street to avoid him. Instead, he'd put his arm around Jim's big shoulders and suggest they get some coffee at his place. There are also local soldiers who have served, are serving, or will serve in Afghanistan and Iraq and no doubt other conflicts around the world. I am sure there is no one here who doesn't support the troops. Of course we do. I'm also sure that even in Haines, where we do have some belligerent folks, there isn't one person who doesn't want peace. In this, I don't think we're all that different from people everywhere. When I said this to Chip, he said, "You worry too much." At the potluck supper concluding the Lenten retreat, I sought the advice of one of the Catholic participants whom I admire. He was wearing insulated canvas coveralls and a beaver fur hat. He agreed that war is terrible. He said he believed in a God who blessed peacemakers, who instructed us to love our enemies. He believed in all that Sunday school teaches. He has a teenage daughter, Nikki, who is blind, hard of hearing, and has trouble speaking and walking as the result of the recurring optical nerve cancer for which she has been treated aggressively since she was an infant. They volunteer together on the country music show on the radio one afternoon a week. It's sometimes hard to understand what Nikki is saying, but I want to so badly that I don't mind when I sometimes can't. Nikki's dad knows a lot about the whys and wherefores of this world. He knows suffering and he knows joy. You can see both in his eyes when he speaks. With him, they aren't separate, but happening at the same time. He said that walking for peace right down the snow-packed streets in broad daylight would be akin to throwing the first stone at a sinner. I'm not going to hold myself up as some perfectly peaceful guy, he said. I'll pray for peace instead. I decided to consult another authority on peace. I have a thin volume on faith by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh that I consult occasionally when I'm stuck. He writes that we have to make peace in our hearts before we can make world peace. Great. Just thinking about peace had conflicted my heart for the better part of a week. The day before the walk, I finally made up my mind not to participate. Chip and I were on a long snowshoe deep in the woods on Mount Rapinski. It was so peaceful, so snowy and quiet, just us and spruce and hemlock trees so old and twisted they could have been Little Red Riding Hood's forest. I knew that the Buddhist monk and Nikki's dad were right. This was my peace march. God wouldn't hear my cries any louder on Main Street than he would right here. Besides, who am I to stand up for peace when I'm so easily ticked at school board meetings? Sometimes I think I'm not cut out for my service on the school board. Just last week, the mayor advocated cutting the school budget, which may mean no more sports, including my beloved cross country. It was terrible news, and I didn't take it well. Also, that new guy who walks everywhere and comes to all the school board meetings was there. I'm not sure who he is or where he's from, but every time I speak, I have the impression that he thinks I'm as dumb as a post, and I'm tired of it. When I asked Father Bob about how to handle such an unpleasant person, he said there must be a reason. There must be a reason why the man is so contrary. He suggested that the next time he speaks to the school board, I should look at him and repeat to myself, this is what Father Bob said, everyone needs to be needed, wants to be wanted, and loves to be loved. Yeah, when you meet a difficult person, repeat this. Everyone needs to be needed, wants to be wanted, and loves to be loved. Father Bob also quoted Thomas Merton, reminding me that mature spirituality is making the connections between our faith and the world we live in. Just like passing the peace in church, I thought. We don't exchange it telepathically. We walk around and grab hands and sometimes hug that peace right into someone else's heart. Sometimes when we do that at our church, we joke around. It's like going Alaman left and Alaman right. I hope we're able to do that again someday. The morning of the Peace Walk, Chip and I went to a St. Patrick's Day breakfast at Don and Becky's house. It was their son Aaron's 30th birthday, and we were having green eggs and ham with about a dozen members of the extended Nash family and their friends. Aaron had been on my running team in high school. He was also a basketball player and one of the most gifted artists ever to graduate from Linus's Haynes High art class. Linus and I both wrote him recommendations to an art school in Washington State. They offered him a scholarship, but he never quite made it there. In fact, he hasn't quite moved out of his parents' house, remaining in Haynes, drawing and painting, fishing with his father, and working in his brother Song's restaurant. It's hard to believe he's 30 already. I sat next to Don and Becky's grandson, Ocean. I am Ocean's fairy godmother. He doesn't have a real godmother because his parents don't go to church. Don and Becky, who raised Ocean's dad to believe in the God of Sunday mornings, daily devotions, and Presbyterian hymns, have adjusted. In the same way that the second song of Isaiah, which we chant in plain song at our church each Sunday during Lent, reminds us, my friend Becky believes that God's ways are not our ways and that his power or hers and love are doing infinitely more than we can imagine. Although Becky probably wouldn't say it that way, she'd probably shrug, open her big blue eyes wide, smile, and say, stuff happens. When Don and Becky's son Lee and his girlfriend Shauna asked to borrow our double kayak years before, I had said sure, and collected the paddles and spray skirts and helped them lift the boat onto the top of their truck. I had no hint of their impending good accident, just as I had none about my bad one. No women's intuition at all that a new life was about to begin, that Becky's first grandchild was about to be conceived. 6 weeks after that overnight camping trip, when Shauna and Lee told Becky they were expecting, Becky was so happy she had to sit down. When they decided to name the baby Ocean, no matter what gender it turned out to be, Becky was so moved she had to lie down. When Ocean was a little over 2 years old, his parents were married on the beach not far from our house. Jesse McGraw officiated. The red-haired local basketball star works for the phone company now, but he had been a deckhand on the Nash family fishing boat when it sank, and he had saved Lee's and Song's lives by holding on to them throughout the night until the Coast Guard helicopter arrived and plucked them out of the ocean, which, as I mentioned before, claimed the life of their little brother, Olin. You know what's crazy? Is that today is the same day that is one of Becky's daughters, Corey. Now, Becky has a lot more grandchildren now than Ocean, and Corey's little boy, Axel, it's his birthday today. And Axel is her youngest son. Her oldest son is named Olin. So it's funny that that's today. At the wedding, Don thanked us all for coming. then said it was fitting that Jesse was officiating, because without him there would be no marriage to celebrate. Do you want to come up? Come on. Trixie wants to walk. Come on. Come on. It's okay. Okay, lie down. Would you? Thanks. Where was I? Oh, at the wedding, Don thanked us all for coming, then said it was fitting that Jesse was officiating, because without him, there would be no marriage to celebrate, and no Ocean, because there would be no Lee. Of course, we all cried happy and sad tears. We couldn't help it. This was such a good ending to such a tragic tale, except that it was not the end. Life at the Nash house, and at yours, and mine, and with any luck at all, will keep rolling along. We love, we fight, we make mistakes, we change, and we redeem ourselves. As Satchel Paige said, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and sometimes it rains. Or as Father Bob said, when a creationist asked him what he thought about Darwin, "Of course I believe in evolution. I don't care if you're a single-cell animal or a bishop. If you don't change, you die." Did you hear that, Trixie? Her breath isn't so good right now. I ran out of dog biscuits, what with the pandemic, and I just don't think they're worth an emergency trip to the grocery store. So she is not happy with me, and they're the ones that make her breath smell a little better sometimes. Anyway, on St. Patrick's Day, in his high chair next to me, Ocean was eating ham and coffee cake. He didn't like the green eggs. For his Uncle Aaron's birthday, Ocean had carefully wrapped a can of tuna fish. He kept tossing it at Aaron, who made much to... I got to start this again. I was distracted by the dog. Okay. On St. Patrick's Day, in his high chair next to me, Ocean was eating ham and coffee cake. He didn't like the green eggs. For his Uncle Aaron's birthday, Ocean had carefully wrapped a can of tuna fish. He kept tossing it at Aaron, who, much to Ocean's delight, caught the fish again and again. Ocean has a great vocabulary for a 3-year-old. He has been taught to use words to solve problems, and that hitting is wrong. His parents never spanked him. Ocean lives in a peaceful family, and he has made a real kind of peace with everyone who loves him and that family. He should inherit a world that has outgrown using guns and bombs to hurt or kill people. He should never have to go to war like Jim did, or return from one to face the challenges he did either. No one should. And that is why after breakfast I joined about 30 folks and walked around town for peace. I think it also may be why Chip came with me. For all my worries, no one who drove by seemed to mind us, and some people beeped in support. Chip's goat hunting friend Ed was even there. Old Ed learned how to survive in the mountains during his childhood in warring and later Nazi-occupied Poland. In his accented English, he said he was walking today because watching the news on television, it sometimes makes me so sad, tears come. After Joanne's letter was read at the Veterans Dinner at the Legion, there was a moment of silence, then applause, and more applause, and finally a standing ovation. Old veterans wiped their eyes, while wives, sweethearts, and daughters wept more openly. I suppose it could be argued that our little Haynes Peace Walk was a lot of fuss for nothing, that no one important paid any attention. As Chip had said, it didn't stop that war. It wasn't even televised. Anderson Cooper didn't cover the march. It made the Chilkat Valley News because Tom was there with a notebook and a camera. But that's about it. And for certain, it would be even easier to argue that the world isn't any more peaceful now just because we willed it to be, for just a little bit of one day. The same could be argued that making one child smile doesn't make the world a happier place. I beg to differ, though. All you have to do is toss Ocean a can of tuna fish and watch him laugh as he catches the fish. to see that is not true. And it's time for Trixie to have a walk. Thanks a lot for being with me and sharing these stories with me. And we'll see you next time. Okay. Up, up. Okay, Trix. Ready? Time for a walk, maybe? I'll see if I can turn this so you can see out the window. Maybe you can see a little bit. Oh, there you go. That's the room that I was in. My bed was over there, and there's the couch. And there's Pearl. She must have heard the word walk. She's ready. She's ready to go. Okay, we're on our way. Till next time.